The UK has recently mandated that financial institutions have full operational resilience by March 2025. And today we hope to answer that question and talk about how technology can be used to implement that requirement. So before we dive in, I'm going to run 2 polls just to gauge who's watching the webinar today. So let me run that first one. And this one is really just, what job roles do you play at the firm? So let us know that. And this really is just a better way that we can kind of tailor the conversation to you guys. All right, you have another 5 seconds, and then I'm going to close it out, and I'll do one more. All right, thank you guys. It looks like it's basically all across the board. And then the second one is, what stage of operational resilient has your firm got to? And we do mention identified IBS and complete mapping. IBS is important business services. So go with that. Wow, this is actually, this is not as all across the board. So that's really interesting. Most people is completed the first self-assessment document. So that's really interesting. Okay, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I'm going to close this out. So let's just dive in. I want to welcome Hugo Warner, Director of Novartis Risk Advisory, who has a wealth of experience in advising firms on compliance. He's implemented operational resilience programs for Novartis clients and previously for Vanguard as well. And joining him today, we have Andrew Engeldow of Babel Street, and he's going to be asking all the questions, both our questions and the ones that you submitted during registration and those that you send in today. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Andrew and Hugo, for being here too.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today. Very much looking forward to the discussion.
Morning, everyone. So, Hugo, let's jump straight in then. So, I understand that the UK Prudential Regulation Authority and the FCA have passed a mandate in March 22 that all financial services must have a state of full operational resilience by March 25, as Ali said earlier on. So, what does that actually mean? Give us a bit of a rundown, please.
Yes, Andrew. So I'd like to start by providing a little bit of background to operational resilience, and it was probably discussed for some time before we saw it come into play by both regulators, the PRA and the FCA. But it was brought into sharp focus ultimately by the pandemic, when business operations were severely disrupted, and primarily in this case by not being able to access their main workspace. So what operational resilience means is allowing firms to be able to evidence steps to be fully operational resilient by March of 2025. So they have a 3-year phasing period between March 22 and March 25. And what it specifically means is these IBSs, the important business services, no matter what level of disruption a firm may face, they need to be able to ensure that they are able to deliver a consistent level of service within their given thresholds or impact tolerances at any point in time.
Okay. So what are these important business services? What are they?
So the important business services, or IBSs, some of the FCA and the PRA having a bit of a giggle about that one, but no, it's ultimately the first step of our 6-step program that we've implemented for a number of different firms. And what these are sort of the critical services that the firms self-identify, and these are the services that the firms must ensure that come what may, no matter what disruption they face, they must remain operationally resilient at all times. So step 1, identifying your IBSs, and working with a number of different clients. Common errors that firms often face is identifying too many IBSs and not having a robust methodology as to how they justify the identification of those IBSs. So as an example, we worked recently with a client who off the bat identified maybe 20 or 30 different IBSs, important business services, across their business, and that simply just wasn't appropriate for the size and appropriateness of the business. So what we did with them was we developed a methodology, managed to bring that number of services down to about sort of 12 to 14. And this is very much in line with the regulation of what the regulators are looking for as well, because the regulator is cognizant of firms having limited resources. And what they want to be able to do is to focus those resources on the really pertinent, important services that are often outward facing to clients, and making those IBSs the ones that are truly operational resilience in no matter what the circumstances.
Thank you. So we've gone through the important business services. So what's the next step?
So step 2 of the 6 would be mapping. So this is mapping out the intricate different processes and systems that are required to deliver each of the IBSs. So if you're going to map out the full delivery chain of all the different resource buckets that underpin each of your IBSs, these are typically people, data, systems, third parties, location in some cases. And the challenge here that many firms face is a lot of the different components of the delivery chain sit in different silos, and in many cases haven't fully been mapped in the past. And this is probably the first time that firms are able to draw together a centralized view of how a single IBS or a single service is ultimately provided to their clients. So as an example, you might look at retail deposits on a bank. This involves multiple different teams, often sat different locations, jurisdictions, sometimes time zones. And mapping these services out in totality allows not only management and the firm to be able to have a full scope of their operational landscape, but also allows them to assess for potential vulnerabilities across that delivery chain.
So vulnerabilities. What do you mean by vulnerabilities in that context then?
So vulnerabilities is one of the key items. If we look at sort of the traditional risk management framework, you probably have all seen likelihood and impact on a graph of some sort on the X and Y axis. The way I like to think of vulnerabilities is sort of the likelihood of an event occurring. So if you're looking along your delivery chain, you might have different resources, and with each of those resources, you hold them to different resource standards. So as an example, you want to minimize the risk of operational disruption happening to that particular resource. You want to minimize the likelihood. So an example of that would be something like testing your IT systems for vulnerabilities to cyber attacks. There are different scoring methodologies on how you can assess the vulnerability of your IT systems, and penetration testing, red team testing, a lot of examples of these. And what that helps to do is reduce the likelihood of that event ever occurring. Another example of testing vulnerability in a different resource might be looking at kind of key staff members and determining whether or not there is appropriate succession planning across senior individuals across the business.
Yeah, thanks. If you don't mind, I want to go back to something you mentioned a little earlier around delivery chain and silos. I mean, how do you break down these silos?
I mean, it's a common issue in many of the clients we work with, particularly some of the larger firms, big banks, insurers, asset managers, and it's ultimately the most holistic way to solve this problem is to make operational resilience a group-wide project. I think the way to look at it is more than just a tick box exercise that needs to be complied with for a new regulation. I think addressing it in a holistic, centralized manner has material benefits across the entire business. You look at operational enhancements, you're looking at sort of more greater efficiencies across the business, and it's again, you have a very clear picture all of a sudden with this mapping process and centralized process of how all these different systems are linked up. And it allows management to provide sort of prioritization of resources where they think a particular area needs enhancement due to operational weaknesses. And it also helps them understand if a particular, let's say a third party was to be impacted in a different jurisdiction or a different part of the business, how ultimately does that impact the IBS of that stakeholder for an example. So quickly, I would just move on to an example for how we helps this to come into context would be sort of the assessment of vulnerabilities for an insurance client that we recently worked with. Across the business, they had different standards on how they were implementing their third-party resiliency standards effectively. Some people had very rigorous standards, other groups had much less high standards. And what we were able to do is by centralizing the entire process, we were able to find where there were potential weaknesses in the firm. We brought up the level of standard across the group, allowed everybody within the group to be able to understand exactly where the weaknesses are by centralizing and breaking down those silos and bringing the team together. And ultimately that minimized the risk of the operational disruption going forward.
Okay. So I think we can all agree that third parties are used extensively across many organisations. At what point do businesses step in and decide that they need to take control around operational disruption?
So this actually leads very nicely onto the third step of 3, which is
Okay.
your impact tolerances. So we go through the process, and you've identified your important business services, your IBSs. You've mapped it extensively across the business, but hopefully kind of getting those silos to start talking to each other and understanding exactly where the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses potentially sit across your business. Then you start setting out your impact tolerances, and ultimately what your impact tolerance is a sort of, again, self-defined threshold, typically a time metric, sometimes minutes, hours, days in some cases. And this is where the firm commits to holding that level of service. So they're effectively ensuring that no matter what, that IBS will always be, will only ever be down or disrupted for a certain period of time. And that's the predetermined impact tolerance. What this effectively stands for is, where at what point does your customer suffer sort of severe intolerable harm? So in order to calculate this, you look across the business for different factors, often derived by the client type, the nature of the business you're working with, and other business metrics. And to try and put that into context for you, you might look at, if you're an insurance firm delivering motor insurance, for example, to a client, the impact tolerance for a roadside breakdown is going to be very, very short. You can't have any form of disruption in providing that service to a client. If you were looking for something that's probably longer based, it might be sort of fraudulent claims and going through courts. It takes a lot of litigation process. This might be much longer because, one, it's less impactful from the overall outcome of the service, but also your types of clients that you're going to be looking for are less sensitive to the disruption. So you're probably looking at more corporates and larger entities that are able to withstand sort of flexibility within their impact tolerance. I think one nice example we worked with recently was with a company where they were an asset manager, and we were working on the trading floor. And if you're all familiar with indexing, you've got to hit a 430 benchmark in market on close for most companies, and that leaves a very, very narrow window to be able to execute trades at a particular time. Now, we actually determined there that the impact tolerance was just a number of seconds, because if the data was inappropriate or there was a potential blackout around the trading system at that particular point in time, there was very, very little time to react before there was severe and intolerable harm being caused to the clients in that particular case. So hopefully that gives a nice variety of how that impact tolerance does vary depending on the client and the type of business you're working with.
Yeah, thanks. So I've got to mention it at some stage. It feels like operational resilience was tested pretty extensively during the pandemic. How has that gone from now? Where are we now with regards to?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I mean, as a kind of intro with COVID, it was kind of very much the catalyst that brought a lot of operational resilience regulations into focus. Inadvertently, there's been a sort of simulation of the loss of workspace in many ways for firms across the industry. And I think you've probably sort of anecdotally, just chatting to different clients and different colleagues, different firms have responded in different manners. Some have been more efficient and were clearly more prepared than others. I don't think everyone's going to air their dirty laundry in public, but I would suggest that it was quite an ask for some firms, particularly the larger ones, to be able to move they're 100% of their workforce to working from home. I think one of the key parts here is stress testing. You've got to be able to evidence that your IBSs are sort of properly operational resilience, and your stress testing can be expanded beyond just loss of workspace. You're looking at loss of potentially of an inspirational CEO or key senior manager, or potentially the loss of a key third party.
So you're referring now, I think, to disaster recovery as well, or at least disaster recovery scenarios. I've heard that banks don't necessarily test their DR capabilities, and with regards to that and operational resilience, how often do you test out your operational resilience plans?
Well, I think this kind of brings us neatly onto sort of step 4 of the key six steps, which is scenario testing, right? Operational resilience, the way we see it, is it's an evolution of operational risk. and disaster recovery. You need to put the controls in place to minimize the likelihood of disruption, but then also through the scenario testing, you're sort of assuming that the disaster occurs, and then you're putting in mitigating or contingency plans in place to minimize the impact that particular event would happen. So the stress testing is a key phase where you have to bring in severe but plausible disruptions. Most firms will have sort of a key risk register with their top risks. I would reference that as a starter for 10 on how you simulate these severe but plausible scenarios and actually simulate, despite all the amazing controls I'm sure a lot of the listeners have in place, now you simulate the loss of Azure as your cloud hosting environment, or your top third party, or as I said before, like a loss of senior management, and how does that impact the firm on a day-to-day basis. I think hopefully what you'll see for many firms, and this is kind of a challenge that firms have over the next 3 years, is enhancing those stress tests. And it's deliberate to give companies 3 years to phase it in, because when done properly, stress tests, they should come close to breaching your impact tolerance. They should identify where those key remediation actions should sit. And it should be a continuous cycle of testing and remediating, in order to ensure that you would achieve that full operational resilience come 2025. In terms of timing, to answer your point directly, at least annually.
Right.
I think, or in line with any sort of material change. So, as an example, I think we worked with a client recently. They were in again insurance company, and they started off with desktop exercises for their stress testing, and then they were building out into a controlled live environment, insofar as, for those of you familiar with the insurance market, exchanging. They simulated the loss of exchanging in a controlled environment. And this was basically the loss of their primary service provider within the market. I might just take the opportunity to talk about step 5. I think it kind of ties in nicely in terms of who's responsible. It's the SMF24 who has to ensure that this happens on a regular basis. This all comes to setting up the governance within the organisation. So there needs to be a governance structure in place, an operating model. Obviously, this facilitates and oversees all of the different processes across the teams within the business, and it pulls together all the, again, this idea of centralizing the entire operation, give firms that really clear landscape of what's happening across the business, and it's all obviously facilitated by an operational resilience policy. And finally, it's fairly new with the sort of accountability of boards. They are responsible for the sign-off of the self-assessment document, which comes at the end of the process.
That's a huge important point. So what are the regulators asking for when they're looking for a test? What processes do they go through?
It's a good question. So, I mean, that brings me nicely onto the final stage, which is the self-assessment document. And this is the item that can be requested at any point by the regulator from sort of March 2022. I think hopefully the poll at the beginning illustrates that many of the listeners are already on track for that and are able to demonstrate that they have a self-assessment document in place. But what this should entail is effectively it's the product of all the previous steps that have happened. You're identifying your IBSs, your mapping, your remediation plans, your tolerances, your assessment of vulnerabilities, all that good work being brought into a single document and outlining sufficiently to the regulator and your senior management for approval, and give them appropriate comfort and outline exactly the understanding of how a firm is going to be achieving operational resilience by 2025. So it continues to build over that sort of three-year phase, and each firm should, at least on an annual basis, be refreshing and renewing their self-assessment document. And at short notice, and I do stress at short notice, sometimes 24 or 48 hours, the regulator can ask to see the self-assessment document.
All right, so it leads nicely onto a question I've got to ask, and I've been waiting for it. What happens if you don't do what you're asked to do? What actions do the regulators take?
Well, I think the most extreme version of sort of punitive actions would be the regulatory fines. I think we all saw the fine that was issued to Lloyd's over poor operational resilience. While this was probably not directly linked to the regulation itself, the regulation was issued after the period in question that Lloyd's was fined for, but it does emphasize the focus that regulators are putting on this topic. I think a less public version of of sort of enforcement would be some form of regulatory supervision. This would be brought about sort of by the regulator asking for your self-assessment document and reviewing it, deeming it not fit for purpose, or in some cases not having it at all. And the repercussions of that are fairly lengthy and expensive remediation steps that have the regulator looking over your shoulder at all times. I think I'll probably just close this point by saying that the firms typically fall into two categories, the ones that, at least the ones that we've been working with recently, and they typically would be sort of first group would be the ones that haven't done anything. They've read the 2025 deadline, and they think, no, don't have anything to do at the moment. We've got plenty of time. We've got 3 years. I would stress that there is a lot of work to be done. It's nice to see again the poll illustrating that many of the listeners have done their first self-assessment document, but there is a huge amount of work to be done by 2025. The second group, which hopefully pertains to the audience here, are those that have completed their first self-assessment document. This can get asked for by the regulator at any point, but there needs to be continuous testing, enhancement, mapping of IBSs needs to get more granular and more detailed. The testing of vulnerabilities and testing of stress test scenarios needs to get more vigorous in order to be able to demonstrate to your senior management and to the regulator that you are on track for full operational redundancy by 2025, and effectively in all circumstances, those self-identified IBSs will remain in service come what may, despite any operational disruptions you face.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, isn't it? At the end of the day. So,
Absolutely.
I think, we're coming to the end of our kind of conversation. Ali, I think we've got another poll we're going to run now. Is that correct? Thank you. So, which aspect of operational resilience has your firm found the most challenging? If you wouldn't mind clicking those. It refers directly to obviously the points that Hugo's been raising, and we're keen to understand where you sit. I do have some other questions that we'll go to in a few minutes, but first of all, Hugo, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. As I say, I'm going to give a few more minutes for this, or seconds, should I say, for this part of the quick poll, and then I'll dive into some questions that were provided to us beforehand. While people are completing that, I'll read the first one out. Which organisations operate red teams to independently test out resilience teams and their work? This is timely in light of the recent fines levied regarding Lloyd's TSB, obviously a point that you mentioned earlier.
So for those, great question. For those that don't know, red team testing is effectively you're independently hiring a cybersecurity firm to test a form of penetration test to work out how sort of protected you are against different cyber attacks. So it's a very popular form of scenario testing at the moment, is to engage with a third party and effectively they try and hack into your systems. They will identify potential weakness areas. They'll send phishing emails, and what they do is they try and it'll be done with no prior warning. So I think we're probably all familiar with the phishing emails you might get sent by sort of internal clients and IT. Now, these ones come with no prior warning at all. So it's a real it's the closest thing to a live test, at least from a cybersecurity perspective, that is in the market at the moment and very popular, particularly with some of the larger firms.
Thanks. So for the audience, there's an opportunity for you to raise questions direct inside the poll itself. There's a section of questions if you'd like to enter them in there. If you have any questions, of course. Going back to ones that are provided to us earlier, Hugo, how can AI tools help in operational resilience? Huge topic.
The flavour of the month, probably of 2023, I would suggest. Now, I think
I'm moving forward.
Yeah, moving forward, exactly. I think AI and technology, they're going to be huge in terms of supporting firms and how they're going to solve this problem. One of the examples I recently came across was embedding AI within call centers, and AI was absorbing all this natural language, and they were coming up with different themes and trends, and it helped firms, one, to simulate different stress scenarios, because it reviewed all the different complaints and the different conversations that were happening at a sort of a client level, and it actually brought up a fresh set of risks that this particular client was able to then stress test, and obviously to a level of severity that was appropriate. So I mean that's one nice example. I think in terms of the use of technology, we've been building tools for different clients that allow sort of, again, the centralization of data is key. So the tool we're working on at the moment with the bank centralizes all the different IBSs. It links into ServiceNow, so you understand exactly how your IBSs are linked to the underlying mapping of IT systems and similar, and it centralizes all your other key points, your stress scenarios, your owners of your IBS. And what it does is, if, for example, a third party, in this case it was Poland, if one of your third parties in Poland was to have an operational disruption, it automatically sends a notification to the owner of your appropriate IBS. They get a flag saying, oh, by the way, this third party is having an issue. What would you like to do? And there are options like take no action. It's within the impact tolerance of whatever it was, 24 hours in this case. But my point being is it's a very proactive way of centralizing, given that sort of very holistic, clear picture of what's happening across the organization. But it's also almost an early warning system as well, using technology to notify the appropriate people at the right time in order to be able to react appropriately and minimize disruptions.
That proactive nature, I'd imagine, is exactly the sort of thing that the regulator is looking for, you to turn reactive environments into a proactive drive. Absolutely. Exactly. One final question here is, excuse me, based on your experience, how are firms that you're interacting with continuing to develop their scenarios, testings and their frameworks? And specifically, where do you think they should be focusing more of their time?
Great question. It's an evolutionary process, particularly stress testings at the moment. A lot of the clients that we worked with initially were doing stress testing, sort of a workshop exercise, talking it through. I mean, it's a risk-based approach, which makes a lot of sense. You want to talk it through in reality because you don't want to have impacts to the broader firm. But the emphasis from the regulator has very much been over the next 3 years. Your stress tests have to get more live, more severe, bringing it into sort of a controlled live environment, like one of the insurance clients we worked with exchanging. You can do simulated red team tests. You can do simulated loss of key CEO or similar. I think the emphasis here is on making it more severe and more dynamic and less well informed. So how well does your firm react to a particular issue? And hopefully firms have documented all these contingency plans. So how well are those contingency plans actually going to be implemented? Have people read the playbooks? Do they understand exactly what happens in event X, Y, and Z? I think the other one that people will often look is, these stress scenarios unfortunately don't always happen totally in isolation. They often have dual impacts. So you might unfortunately simulate two stress scenarios going down at the same time. Maybe this impacts multiple IBSs, and there might be a case where your contingency plan can't work in that event because for whatever reason that stress scenario takes out that particular contingency action. So the emphasis is continuously, as you said, staying in front of the curve, demonstrating to the regulator that you're always looking to enhance, always looking to improve. And the more severe and more robust the stress tests are, the greater comfort the regulator is going to get when evidenced in the self-assessment document that your firm is going to be operational resilient no matter what.
Brilliant. Hugo, listen, we've come to almost the end of our time now, half an hour. I'm going to hand back now to Ali just to wrap up for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Hugo and Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time for making this webinar happen.